WCS. And just before we start quickly, if you're expecting that for some magical reasons, I'm going to tell you exactly the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic in the sense where it happened and how it exactly happened. That's not going to be the case. I'm going to give you some background, though, of emerging infectious diseases generally, and then what is known at the moment on COVID-19 update. Just let me give you a little background on WCS. So the Wildlife Conservation Society works in about 11 regions across the world in 60 country programs. That's really boots on the ground in the sense of offices, employees and infrastructure. And there's so about 4,000 individuals across our country programs working. And basically the mission of WCS is to save wildlife and wild places worldwide through science, conservation action, education, inspiring people. You're now going to wonder, why am I talking on a health-related team? And that is because WCS has got about 100 years of history with wildlife health. It's more than 100 years ago that they set up their wildlife health program. And they're also one of the One Health founders. And one of the interesting things that's come out really strongly in the last two and a half years is that it's a huge benefit to be an organization that is multidisciplinary at its core, like many academic institutions as well, but within one single institution, like you'd sort of see one institute. But more importantly is that we work across sectors. That's just inherent in what we do. We work with government partners across all sectors. Often WCS is the organization in the room that has the most access to all the ministries and administrations across the country, which makes implementing One Health approaches much easier. And in 2004, the Wildlife Conservation Society was a co-sponsor or initiated a process called One World, One Health, and sort of really brought the term One Health to a broader public with the so-called Manhattan Principles. And in 2019, with the support of the German government, we updated those so-called Manhattan Principles in Berlin with what's now known as the Berlin Principles on One Health. And this was a mere few months before the first cases of COVID-19 were reported. Just a little bit background on One Health. I think by now everyone has heard this term and knows more or less what it means. But I'd like to just give you our take on One Health. So basically, One Health recognizes the intrinsic and intertwined relationship between the health of animals, plants, people, fungi, and the environment. And it's often shown as these three circles in the Venn diagram, and that's actually not very useful, because it sort of, first of all, it always implies that it's a static relationship and that you always need all three components and so on and so forth. But the way we do look at it as a conservation organization that works at this nexus between health and the environment is that an intact biosphere is the foundation for health of all, and all other processes related to health need to be supported by an intact and functioning biosphere. So that's the way we approach our One Health. And I think this, including the SDGs in the One Health discussion and framing, is actually very valuable as we move forwards. Obviously, the background on which all these problems, and especially now our public health problems, are is this rapid change to our planet, to the tightly interlinked multiple crises of biodiversity loss, climate change, and global inequities, which drive this ongoing public health crisis and possibly the next one on the horizon already. So that's our background. So let me now move into infectious emerging diseases and give you just a little bit of background and perspective on those as we discuss this during this morning session here. So what we're particularly interested in are zoonotic origin pathogens. These are these are pathogens which originate in animals and then move between animals and humans. Often they fulfill the classic definition of a zoonosis. That would be when a pathogen's reservoir host or a group of animals or a single species of animal harbors the pathogen and allows it to constantly spill over into humans. And a classic example for that would be rabies. That is a clear, simple, absolutely preventable, by the way, zoonotic disease. The reservoir is different in Southeast Asia and India and so on. It would be domestic dogs, which maintain mostly the virus. Here in North America, it's actually quite a lot more complicated. It's raccoons and skunks and foxes, depending on which part of the country you're in. That's a classic zoonotic disease. They have a massive impact globally. But what we're really worried about are the emerging infectious diseases, those that are dominated by unknown or potential pathogens that we don't know yet. And it's important to note that it's about 70% of all these zoonotic origin emerging infectious diseases come from wildlife, and their frequency is increasing. So if you look at the number of outbreaks that have been recorded, there is a trend towards them being increasing. But what's probably more important, honestly, is that the impact is increasing. And if I add here, put that in yesterday night, of course, we've got sort of this new emergence of a known pathogen, but with a really extraordinary spread. I haven't had time this morning to look at the news, but last night when I went to sleep was in about 16 countries, certainly on 4 continents, that we suddenly have monkeypox. That's never happened before at that scale. So there is this impact which is increasing, and the geographic or the spatial spread is definitely changed. And the modelers, of course, have been out there and are showing us that there is a good, there's good and robust modeling, at least, to suggest that these epidemics are going to increase, and it's not particularly a surprise. If I take an example from the ground and just look at the Ebola virus disease, it was discovered in 1976 in what was then Zaire. There have been 14 outbreaks since 1976, recorded outbreaks. 10 of those have happened in the last 13 years, and 7 of those since 2018. And there's an ongoing outbreak again. Every time I do this presentation in the last 3 years, more or less, I keep saying there's an ongoing outbreak, and it's not always the same one. It's actually, again, a new one that has started. So this has now become practically constant in the DRC. So let's look at SARS-CoV-2. First of all, let's just be clear, this is not a surprise. The extent and the impact of the disease of this pathogen is a surprise. I think everyone that's involved, even marginally involved, would be surprised at the impact, the global impact on trade, on the impact on mortality and morbidity. I think that's something that may have been expected, but the follow-on costs, the economic costs and so on have been certainly underestimated by orders of magnitude. And this has been known that a respiratory virus is going to emerge at some stage and spread. Had not only been warned in the WHO publication 2018 when they talk about a disease X. Once it's on the title page of Time magazine and other places like that, I think you would actually expect the global community to take notice. But as we know, that didn't happen, and all scenario plannings and so on had been ignored by that time. So let me just move on. So one thing we do know about SARS-CoV-2 is that it's a zoonotic origin pathogen. There's a whole slew of these SARS-related viruses, and when I mean a slew, I'm talking about thousands of them that are hosted by bat species. They vary in relatedness, and in the last 12 months or so, more and more research, people gone back to their freezers, took out old samples, ran sequencing on them, and we've discovered closer and closer related viruses in bats. So the ancestral host, there's no question about it, that's a bat species. The time, place, and mechanism of the spillover event is still somewhat unclear, and there is certainly still some information lacking. But in the last 6 months or so, there's been repeated reanalysis of the emergence of SARS. And there have been three very important, and I have to say this is, you can only say this in 2022, we couldn't have said this a few years ago. There's three really important preprints out there at the moment from known, well-established research groups that have looked at, especially this amongst other, the spatial spread of SARS and the emergence of SARS-CoV-2 at the market in Wuhan. And they've also looked at some of the early genetic data that talks about that there were probably two spillover events, distinct spillover events within a pretty constrained time frame. And as I was saying, at the same time, there was a whole slew of papers being published of novel or newer SARS-related viruses in bats, but I have to say also in hedgehogs and other species, both from the SARS lineage, but also MERS lineage, have been found and published in the last few things. That, of course, as you all know, has not stopped the continuous discussion and about a lab leak origin. And this is in a huge problem that we probably weren't aware of as much before the SARS-CoV-2, and that is the huge politicization of science. So science is sometimes sidelined as discussions go on, obviously in the media, but more importantly, sometimes scientific journals also pick this up. And probably the biggest shocker, at least from my point of view, was that PNAS, which I always thought was a great great journal and was something you wanted to publish in, actually published this letter just last week, which actually had absolutely no new news at all. The authors are neither virologists nor epidemiologists, but have been two of a group that have been pushing, that have been constantly pushing a lab leak theory. So I was very surprised and in some way also disappointed that this was still going on. I'm not going to be able to provide you a solution here either today, but I'm happy to talk about if there is any questions, talk about these two opposing views. One of the really interesting things, though, that we have to be very clearly aware of, and there's no contention here at all, that the disease SARS-CoV-2 has changed. And one of the things that's really changed in the last, let's say, 6 to 8 months is that we've seen more and more spillback. So the virus moves from humans into wildlife and then can move back into humans. Now, the cases of animals, of virus moving back into humans, actually limited to 3 species. And that is, it's been confirmed for mink, it's been confirmed for hamster in a Hong Kong outbreak, and it's a probable in white-tailed deer as well. Now gives the whole disease issue a new dynamic. So that's something we need to be quite aware of, that this is ongoing. And as I said, the white-tailed deer, I didn't look yet. It was preprint, but I think they're on the verge of that being published in a peer review, or being coming out in a peer-reviewed journal. So that's quite an interesting and worrisome scenario, because of course white-tailed deer, for those who don't know, about 40% of the populations of white-tailed deer, and there's millions of them in the US, are positive for SARS-CoV-2. Now, what's important is that this pandemic, of course, also raises an opportunity, a shift in perception and in a shift in understanding of our interdependence on the natural world, because the drivers of this public health crisis are very similar or the same as the drivers of biodiversity loss and climate change. We know that these same drivers increase the number and the severity of infectious and non-infectious diseases. And the same drivers, as I said, deforestation, extractive industries, and other ecosystem degradation are the main drivers of this emergence. And I have to be really careful here as well. There is a lack of robust information because very little work had been funded in the past to actually look at these spillover mechanisms. And there is a whole community out there that is weaponizing, and there's no other way to say it, it's weaponizing this lack of information, in the sense that no information means it is not happening. So that's another thing we should maybe discuss afterwards. So let's just simplify this for the discussion today. It's really all about interfaces. We don't have to worry too much about separate pathogens. And these so-called pathogens, they'll be circulating in wildlife and sharing between wildlife in intact forests. They constitute a hazard, but there is absolutely no risk related to them. We in the Royal, we estimate there's several 100,000 of these viruses with zoonotic potential circulating in these forests. And it's not an issue, of course, but we all know that these forests don't really exist anymore. Most of these forests look like something like this, and you have a road which goes from A to B. But if you look at it from a disease perspective, what you've created with that road, if you look at it carefully, you've created a huge interface that may be, hundreds of kilometers long into ecosystems where these viruses are circulating. And then by providing infrastructure and bringing people and livestock into these areas, you're providing a platform for viruses to spill over. And these spillovers are happening all the time, but it's actually quite difficult for a virus to acquire the necessary traits to suddenly switch a species, actually infect a human or its livestock, and then replicate there and then spread within that new species. Obviously, humans will reach out to humans. And then the most importantly, and I think the best example we have of that is actually monkeypox at the moment, is how quickly a previously endemic pathogen can spread across the globe. And there's basically no place anymore on this globe that is not connected within, let's say, 24 hours to any other major city in the world. And that's a big, big change in the last 2 decades. So if we have a hazard, and that's actually per se not a problem, but it's what we do that creates the risk. And these are the known factors that we already have. So it's all about these interfaces, and it's about our behaviors and practices at these interfaces. Basically, as I was saying, it's quite difficult for a virus to slip through all the natural barriers that are put up between one host species and the other. And you've seen this in the public arena in the last 2 years with the Swiss cheese model, the idea that only when these Swiss cheese holes align and you don't wear your mask and you don't get vaccinated and you behave badly and so on and so forth, the virus will slip through and get you, so to say. But this is what's happening in the wild as well. We're innately smart people, of course, so we do a lot of things that break down all these natural barriers and allow viruses to slip across. And one of those would be bringing wildlife from various different places, stacking them all together on top of each other so they can exchange viruses because they're still alive, and create new recombinations and new viruses that then get across these decreased barriers. So that's one way just to look at what's happening in these markets and along the trade interface. As you move these animals across along the trade, viruses will accumulate, the prevalence will accumulate, and then we've been able to show that using a coronavirus proxy. As these animals moved from the field into the restaurant kitchen, they acquired or increased their prevalence significantly from 2 in 10 to to 5 in 10, basically, or a bit more actually. So once it's cooked, like on this photo, then of course it doesn't constitute a problem, but the cook that prepared that animal, he would be your index case as well. So let me just finish up with 2 slides here. We spend a lot of time looking at pathogens, and obviously we enjoy, as veterinarians, wildlife veterinarians, that's one thing we like to do, find new viruses, describe how they spill over, and so on. But we do also have to be really clear that we have to invest more and more time looking at the markets, what is driving, what are the socioeconomic drivers of putting these roads in there, the extractive industry of the mining, and then we also have to get over this idea that there are patches of the world which are so remote that it doesn't matter to us what's happening there. Because each and every one of us is connected to every other place on this planet within hours. So, and that is a huge difference when you think back just 20 years to SARS-1 outbreak. There was so much less traffic at the time when compared to today. And then obviously, the other thing is the costs. We do need to talk about the costs, whereas previous outbreaks were in the tens of billions of dollars, which obviously constitute a massive economic crisis and certainly surpass the International Monetary Fund's threshold for major economic disasters in many of the countries where they occurred. That big black thing there on the edge, those are the trillions of dollars we're talking about now with SARS-CoV-2. And colleagues of ours have very nicely and robustly shown that the costs and benefits of primary prevention at source really, really makes sense. And so with that, I won't go into policy because I know Sue Lieberman will be talking about that later. And I thank you for your attention for this. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Chris. And greetings, everyone. I'm Sue Lieberman, Vice President for International Policy with the Wildlife Conservation Society. And we have just, if we want to keep to time, we have just a few minutes, actually 5 minutes for some questions. If there are no questions, you can also put your question in the chat and we'll try to answer it at the end. But are there any questions specifically for Chris? But don't feel pressure. If you have a question, we hopefully will have time at the end. And I don't see any hands up or anything in the chat. I'm more used to Zoom, but I think I can figure Teams out as well. In that case, let's move on to the next speaker. And I think, Tanya, are you going to introduce the next speaker?
Yeah, thanks, Sue. And thank you so much, Chris. Really interesting and good scene setting for the rest of it. So yes, we'll move on to the second session of the webinar, which is going to be first kicked off by my colleague at Northumbria University, Dr. Francis Massey, talking about the project that he and colleagues ran. I can let you talk about the funding, Francis, but the Wildlife Trade Futures Project, and then we'll have a series of case studies showing and explaining how this is looking like in different parts of the world. So, Francis.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. I'm just going to set myself up here, hopefully without any trouble. Do we see that? Okay. Good. Okay. I'm going to turn my video off because my internet can be kind of shaky. But good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm one person of many on this project called Wildlife Trade Futures. So I'm sort of speaking on behalf of the project. And the project is funded by UK government, so specifically the UKRI Global Challenges Research Fund, and there was a specific call looking at research to kind of investigate, examine the effects of COVID-19, especially with regards to global challenges and the global south. So it's kind of development-focused funding. So that kind of provides a bit of the context. And at the end, I'll put all the names up of all the collaborators on the last slide. So I think Chris's presentation provides really good context and setting, as Tanya mentioned. So I'm going to skip a bit of the preamble I had because I think a lot of that was covered, and just start with the point that, going back to that point about the early reports linking the emergence of COVID-19 to wildlife trade, and specifically the wild meat trade, and how the pandemic has really thrown the wildlife trade into a global spotlight for its potential to spread zoonotic diseases, again, which are those infectious diseases that jump from animals to humans. And where our project comes in is looking at how this has motivated calls to regulate and specifically to ban the wildlife trade, among other interventions, looking to strengthen control over the trade in wildlife and wild animal products for the purposes of public health, specifically related to zoonotic diseases. So there are many proposed and already implemented measures that have come out of COVID-19. And one of the kind of things we're looking at is how this intersects with the reality of hundreds of millions of people around the world being reliant on wild meat for food security and livelihoods. So this means there are significant nutritional costs of removing wild animal products from supply chains alongside other social and cultural costs. And it's for this reason that we're trying to pay close attention to the consequences and effectiveness of attempts to regulate the wildlife trade to reduce public health and zoonotic disease risks. Okay, I'm just trying to move through my slides here. You're not seeing movement of slides, are you? There we go. Okay. So kind of the aim of our work is really to understand how COVID-19 is reshaping global wildlife trade landscape. And the objective of this is to provide policymakers and others working in the field with evidence-based guidelines on how to best mitigate the ecological and public health risks of wildlife trade in a COVID-19 or post-COVID-19 era in ways that are attentive to power relations, inequalities, and issues of justice. So like Chris, we're not here to propose kind of solutions and magic bullets, but to think critically about existing ways of approaching this challenge and possible alternatives that we can think more seriously about. And in doing this, we take a range of social science perspectives to show how changing human-wildlife relationships, structural inequalities, and power relations intersect to impact wildlife economies in a variety of ways, including heightening or reducing the risks of zoonotic diseases. So again, this is really about kind of trying to provide evidence-based guidelines. And there are three areas of focus that our project has looked at. The first is tracking global trends and policy responses to COVID-19 and wildlife trade. And this is what I'm going to focus on in this presentation. And then there are going to be some colleagues who are going to provide case studies on looking at the impacts of COVID-19 on the wildlife trade supply or value chain, looking specifically at the wild meat value chain in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Cameroon. And then using all of this empirical material, we're trying to think through and bring together insights into how critical social science can enhance our understanding of the relationship between wildlife economies and zoonosis, along many of the lines that Chris has mentioned. So again, going back to the beginning, we noticed early reports linking COVID-19 to wildlife trade and markets, and how this was motivating governments to formulate or consider stricter regulations on wildlife trade, including blanket bans. So what we did was compile a range of materials to do an analysis and try to capture what was happening in the wildlife trade policy landscape in response to COVID-19. So we gathered media outputs discussing wildlife trade policy and legislation. We specifically compiled country legislation that was adopted in response to COVID-19, and also did a search in gray literature and peer-reviewed literature to try to find any policy or proposed policy responses to deal with wildlife trade in the COVID-19 era. We also participated in lots of virtual events discussing this issue, including those by WCS, and to try to triangulate this data and kind of find any gaps that we may not have found in our search. We did a survey of experts to try to confirm policies and changes that we had were actually happening, and also to identify ones that may not have been reported on. And one point we need to emphasize is that this is an ongoing project, and the data used for this presentation is up to 2021. So there's a lot that has likely changed. And if there's anyone out there that's kind of working on something similar with more recent data, it'd be great to chat. So we do recognize that things could have changed in the last year. We unfortunately have just not had the time to kind of keep up with the analysis. So what we found is that in many cases, new restrictions were implemented as an emergency response to COVID-19 and on a temporary basis. There are, however, some restrictions that were made permanent after being extended, expanded, or just introduced from scratch. And these that were made permanent are often part of national zoonotic disease risk reduction strategies. And here are the ones you can see on this map with new or amended policies, specifically in response to COVID-19. And while much of the debate has been on wildlife and wildlife trade, we also noticed that there's quite a lot of policy and discussion around farm animals, both domestic and quote unquote wild, to manage zoonotic disease spillover. So these risks are seen to come from both domesticated and wild species, and those that are kept in domestic or captive conditions, whether they're farmed or for exotic pets and so forth. So quite a few governments have implemented new restrictions on farmed animal products in addition to wildlife trade. So one of these examples is the regulations on the mink farming we saw as kind of this spill back issue. And a lot of these policies and legislations on domestic animals or kind of farmed animals have largely focused on those that have been proven to be hosts of COVID-19, with mink being one of them. There are, however, cases where governments have introduced new restrictions on the trade in farm species not known to be hosts of COVID-19, but that move through supply chains with limited or poor regulations around infectious disease control and sanitation. So one example of this new type of ban is a ban on slaughter and consumption of farmed dog meat in Cambodia. And next to trade restrictions, the most prevalent intervention we've seen has been behavioral change campaigns. These are campaigns that aim to reduce consumer demand for what are seen as risky animal products and encourage a shift towards eating more sustainably produced food in areas where alternative food sources are available. Some research, for example, by Traffic, has identified 12 examples of behavioral change campaigns initiated during the COVID-19 pandemic. There are also a lot of efforts to improve hygiene and health measures, many of these being simple practices like avoiding the mixing of different species in markets and ensuring markets undergo regular veterinary inspections. Such practices are not always sufficiently practiced or enforced, however. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen significant investments made in trying to improve food hygiene and sanitation in both wild and domestic meat supply chains. One example of this is the Food Safety and Standard Authority of India undertaking audits of private slaughterhouses and implementing a hygiene rating of fish and meat shops across the country for improved hygiene and health standards. And there's also been quite a big uptick in support for enforcement. And experience across the wildlife trade sector has shown that a lack of political will and resources can lead to limited enforcement of existing laws, policies, and standards. During the pandemic, several governments began working closer with NGOs and IGOs to strengthen wildlife trade enforcement and judicial measures. One example of this is Malaysia, that launched a new enforcement organization to tackle wildlife trade, combining wildlife authorities, the police, state agencies, and NGOs. And finally, one of the other measures we see increase quite a bit are surveillance and detection systems related to zoonotic diseases. So at the global level, we see the World Health Organization, Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Organization for Animal Health established the Zoonotic Disease Integrated Action Initiative in June of 2020. And this was to help assist with detection and monitoring of zoonotic disease pathogens to support global preparedness, monitoring, and emergency response. And related to this, there's been a significant investment in the development of tools that are meant to be used to predict areas, countries, and regions that are at high risk for zoonotic spillover events. These tools combine data such as epidemiological data, wildlife trade change analyses to identify risky spillover interfaces. Examples of this are the UN Biodiversity Lab, Wild Meat Data Explorer, and Wildlife Trade Sustainability Tool that are all examples of launched or forthcoming tools to help decision makers identify spatial threats linked to zoonotic disease risk. And for the most part, new government restrictions on wildlife trade are not blanket bans, but they target one or more part of wildlife supply chains. By far, the majority of the policies we've seen and the legislations we've seen come into place put new restrictions on intermediaries in the supply chain. So these include transporters, traders, vendors, importers, and exporters. So we see much less at harvesters and consumers. And if you're wondering why that adds up to more than 100%, it's because some policies and legislations address more than one stakeholder group. So one of our motivating factors and one of the things that came out of this research has been some concerns with wildlife trade bans, some that are kind of specific to zoonotic diseases, but some that are kind of more general concerns with blanket bans. Bans can be effective at controlling formal trade in wildlife, but trades like the wild meat trade often occur informally and through institutions and networks that are inherently difficult to regulate. Bans on entire trade chains also have the potential to lack the specificity for the most effective interventions. So one of the kind of research findings that came out of the work in the DRC that is currently under review is looking at how where along the wild meat supply or value chains the risk for zoonotic disease transfer or spillover is highest. And what we see is that the risk is significantly higher among different actors or stakeholders in the value chain, depending on the area and depending on the type of meat. So this could be, for example, much higher risk, as is in the case of DRC, in the consumer kind of market areas. And in those areas, we can identify kind of fairly simple, straightforward interventions of how to reduce that risk. So the focus on banning kind of the entire trade rather than focusing on where risks are highest and therefore potentially interventions can be most effective can potentially be a bit short-sighted. And so one thing we want to do when thinking about kind of the policy aspects and practice aspects of this is kind of looking for alternatives. And again, these are not kind of silver bullet solutions, but part of a broader package, kind of linking up with what Chris was saying. I think one of the big messages we see is that there's a need for context for policies and legislation and interventions to be context specific. But we see kind of 4 areas that we can try to support in terms of kind of looking at the broader kind of structural drivers that underpin zoonotic disease risk in terms of wildlife trade. So the first is supporting local wildlife trade governance. And this means effective interventions must be based on kind of a nuanced, sound understanding of unique cultural, ecological, economic, social, and political contexts. There are numerous and diverse forms of wildlife trade that occur in territories of indigenous peoples, for example, that have been internationally recognized and have rights protected to control decisions about what happens on their land and shared resources. So various governments, IGOs, and NGOs are exploring options for creating more robust regulatory regimes for wildlife trade. There's a simultaneous need to support local governance of wildlife trade. At the most basic level, this could involve governments co-designing interventions with Indigenous peoples in these territories to ensure policies and legislations are effective, but also accepted by people living in the area where they're implemented. A second is strengthening local food systems. So in areas where people depend on wildlife for survival and food security, or where it's culturally embedded, neither the provision of short-term compensatory funds or behavioral change campaigns are likely to shift food preferences away from risky animal products in the long term. The development of desirable, affordable, accessible, and sustainable food alternatives, however, could help drive this shift. And one example here is the Sustainable Wildlife Management Program. This is an initiative by the FAO and CIFOR and WCS, and is currently trialing research across 13 countries to support communities in diversifying access to animal-based food products. Third, compensatory funds are occasionally mentioned in research and policy discussions as part of a larger policy and management response when new restrictions are placed on wildlife trade. We don't see any examples of this intervention being used in practice in our research, but the idea of compensatory funds is to provide financial compensation for stakeholders who are transitioning from sectors with high zoonotic risks to other forms of revenue or income generating activities. And the idea is to mitigate the food security and economic shocks caused by bans, transitions, or other prohibitions on wild animal protein. Now, I think these are best understood as short-term emergency measures used to encourage adherence with new policies and legislations rather than long-term solutions. And the last point we want to make is about securing land tenure. Tenure regimes that protect Indigenous people and local communities tend to benefit biodiversity, and conserving biodiversity reduces the risk of zoonotic spillover. So with this in mind, interventions that can secure land claims and promote Indigenous managed lands could help achieve biodiversity objectives and in turn lower the likelihood of spillover events between wild animals and humans. Some examples of this are existing areas of Indigenous territories that have strong control over the land and resources and tend to guard them against illegal and often legal large-scale mining, industrial logging, and other activities that disturb these habitats and landscapes and create those pathways for transmissions. So that's a bit of a whirlwind tour, but hopefully provides a bit of an overview of the type of work we have been doing and hope to continue doing. You can check out a policy brief that kind of provides more detail and an overview of basically this presentation, as well as the website. And as I said, I'm just one member of a large team of different universities and practitioners. So happy to be in touch with anyone who's interested to chat more, and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Francis. So next we are going to hear from Dr. Xiao Lingyun. But maybe while she's sharing her presentation, Francis, Scott Robertson from WCS has asked, are the different policies, legislation you refer to on the project website? So Xiao, if you want to get ready.
Yeah, so in the policy brief, there's more detail, which is available on the website. And we also have a database of kind of proposed policies and legislations that we would like to make available, but as it's sort of a work in progress with a lot of fine tuning needed before that happens, but definitely happy to chat further about that.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and I see Karis has chimed in there as well. So thank you. We'll turn to our next presentation now.
Thank you, Tanya. Can you hear me? Okay. So hello everyone. It's a great honor to communicate with you guys about the information from my side. So I'm Lingyun Xiao, assistant professor in Xian Liverpool University in China, and I'm going to talk more specifically about the policy changes in China after the pandemic. I think, as the context already set by the previous two speakers here, so I think it's no need for me to emphasize again that the spillover of zoonotic pathogens and the biodiversity losses share the same causes. For example, for deforestation and wildlife trade. So we all reached to agreement that a cost-effective measure to prevent the next pandemic actually relies on the protection of natural habitats, such as those tropical forests, and a curb on wildlife trade. That's also the reason why China has taken a proactive and unprecedented action, which is to ban wildlife consumption for food and the related farming, transportation, and trade activities. As shown here in this comic, you see it's not the consumption is banned, it's forbidden now. It's also all the sections related to it, hunting and transportation and trade, and also farming. So this is the first time that actually also mentioned by Chris that for the first time the opportunity that this pandemic has provided to us. So this value of One Health, or how to say, like the idea that we take this human health risk into consideration, which is linked with biodiversity conservation, is mainstreamed in China and also in this policy changing procedure. So this is now if you were in China, you could see all types of posters produced by the government, similar like this one. So it says to fight against the COVID-19, we need to say no to consume wildlife as food. And this is two brothers who become famous even before the consumption ban, that they are wildlife farmers who raised these bamboo rats. So they uploaded a lot of short videos to the social media, to the social media platforms, which make them famous because those bamboo rats are cute. And they, together with a lot of wildlife farmers from the rural area, they appealed loudly against the ban after the ban was issued at the first time. So this ban was different from the one which is issued after SARS. That was the temporary one, just released by lower level of government, but this one is issued by China's highest legislature, the Standing Committee of People's Congress of China, and it is also a permanent one. And it also initiated a series of revision and modification of laws and related regulations. So just to add more explanation about the ban itself, it's not a blanket ban. It's only related with food consumption on wildlife, and it was only concentrated on terrestrial wild animals. So livestock, poultry, and all the other animals in this so-called catalog of animal genetic resource will continue to be regulated by another law, which is the animal husbandry law. So they were not affected by the ban, and the wild plants are not involved. Also, the aquatic species like fish and amphibian and some reptile species was not affected by the ban. And also animals and animal products for non-edible use. including scientific research, traditional medicine, pets, and for display purposes, they will continue to be regulated by existing laws. After the ban was released, or even before it was released, there are quite a lot of voices coming out from the internet, mostly from scholars. They showed their concern, this great concern about making a permanent ban on wildlife trade might be a terrible mistake. I agree to most of the points raised here. They are making good points, and all of them make sense. But back then we were thinking, well, none of those voices comes from China. So we think it's really needed to be some voices coming from people who are within this country. We know what is going on, and all those heated discussions inside China, inside not only different governmental agencies and also NGOs, people who care about wildlife and people who care about pets, all those different groups of people, we have all those debates. So we think it should be a good idea for us to summarize this entire procedure and what we think, what we have concluded after this debate. We're not saying that all the things we are expressing here is true or is correct. It's just a starting point for maybe a longer term monitoring and study for a better understanding of wildlife consumption and trade in China. So that's why we published this article on current biology last year, talking about why do we need a wildlife consumption ban in China under the current circumstances, that is pre-pandemic circumstances. As we all know that, so this paper contains five sections, and due to time limit today, I will only go through 4 of them. So China have adopted a supply-side wildlife conservation approach, which is very nicely expressed by this quotation from the Wildlife Protection Law of China. I have translated it here for you. So for species under special state protection, which is a list of protected species under the highest level of protection in China, only farmed individuals that were captive bred for at least 2 generations could be traded. And for other species, wildlife utilization should concentrate on farmed individuals and should benefit wild populations. So you could see that from this statement, China tried to channel the utilization of wildlife into farmed individuals instead of wild captured individuals. And as long as the individual is captive bred for longer than 2 generations, then it would be much easier for you to get a license to trade for it. It also emphasizes that it should benefit wild populations, but how? There's quite a few existing literature talking about under which circumstances that this supply-side wildlife conservation approach could actually benefit wild populations. For example, this one. And you could see here, I won't go into detail about those standard, but you could see here there are biological considerations, how feasible to raise this kind of species in farms. Do you need to capture wild individuals to reboost the farmed population? And also the cost effectiveness economically, say if it is not really cost effective, then the farmer may feel it's easier or cheaper to just simply capture some individuals from the wild and claim that they are just farmed individuals. And the difficulties to tease apart farmed and wild individuals is quite high. So it's not a very easy job for the market supervision department to really tell the difference. So, so those framework, the existing framework is really good, but none of those existing in China. So that the situation is like shown in this figure, all the species, maybe except those permanently banned ones, for example, elephant, rhino, and tiger, those permanent banned ones, all the other species, if you can get a license for it, for example, a trade license, then you could actually legalize the trade and just sell it. So when the officials who are making the judgment to issue a license to someone, to some animal trader or a farmer, they don't really have any of these standard evidence-based or science-based standard to refer to. So they have to make their own judgment based on their own previous experience. And naturally, you could think the corruption problem, the issue with corruption will turn out. And in those, so the whole management system for wildlife trade, they kind of scattered into different departments. For example, forestry department for terrestrial species, agriculture department for issuing the license for aquatic species, and then before everything enter into different market, we have the quarantine certificate, which is issued by agriculture department again. And then when it enters into markets, we have the market supervision departments. And the lack of collaboration among all those different departments is also one obstacle for a well-functioning management system for this wildlife trade supply chain. For all the farming licenses we have downloaded and looked into, there's a serious problem that you have only the species names listed inside the farming license, but there's no limitation on numbers, like how many individuals you could have in your farm for one single species. So it means that if you are a wildlife farmer with a license, then you could just simply, capture some individual from the wild to put it into your farm and claim it as a farmed species, farmed individual. So that's also why, in some cases, not all of them, but in some cases, the wildlife farms has becoming the laundry places for the poaching activities.
So sorry to interrupt, but you're out of time. So if you could wrap up so we could move on to our next case study, please.
Okay. So so maybe I will try to. So we kind of summarized from all the licenses we downloaded related to wildlife, and also the criminal cases we have downloaded from the from a database. And we found that in this year, around 2018, there is an increasement of both licenses and criminal cases related to wildlife. So it might be related to the one policy issued released that year by talking about using wildlife farming as a tool of poverty alleviation. Okay, so and the other part of this problem of this management system is the outdated protected species list. As we could see from this timeline here, the two protected species lists which were issued in these 2 years, 1989 and 2000, they have been outdated for quite a long time, and until now, one of them is updated recently, and the other one was just released, updated draft. And so we also analyzed those outdated protected species list, and we found that according to the IUCN threatened status, they are there are quite a lot of species which are not protected, so not listed in those two national level protected lists, which means they are not protected by law, still contains a lot of threatened species. So this is the situation that is countered the well-functioning of management system. And also the lack of quarantine protocols. So we have, in China, if we have the wildlife species which want to sell in the market, they need to go through, we call it the production place quarantine protocol and slaughter quarantine protocol. And those protocols, those certificates, there are some existing standards for the vet to refer to, and but there are not so many existing standards for wild animals, especially this one. It's no wild animal species was involved, but for this one, it only refers to some wild species which have their relative species in livestock and poultry. For species such as bamboo rats, palm civets, or porcupine, actually no quarantine protocol could be referred to. And
sorry, I think we're going to have to move on. I'm really sorry to interrupt, but we have two other speakers that are. So if you have any, yeah. But if there's any questions, I think we can follow up.
Maybe that is the last slide, and the other ones I can just, yeah. And when we are extracting all those trade licenses from the website of governmental, like governmental bureaus, and we extracted 254 species which are traded for commercial purposes. And when we check them in this wide world animal health information system, we found at least 69 species of them was identified previously as possible host or vectors for at least one zoonotic disease. So that means those lack of quarantine protocols really posed a great public health risk for people. Okay, so
great, thank you very much.
Yeah, skip the other parts.
Francis, back to you. He's going to be sharing some of the CIFOR work that was done on the wildlife trade futures from Cameroon and from the DRC.
There's two presentations that were recorded by colleagues. The first by Natalie Van Viet, who basically headed up the Democratic Republic of Congo case study, and a second by Joseph Mbane, who led the Cameroon case study. So I'm just going to try and play this from the start. And
good morning, everyone. I'm Natalie Van Vliet, Associate Researcher at the Center for International Forestry Research. Thank you, Caris and Tanya, for inviting me to participate in this workshop. The results that I will present are part of a collaboration between CIFOR, Birmingham, Sheffield, Northumbria, and Manchester University.
We've lost sound, Francis. I think you have to stay unmuted. Sorry, I think you have to stay unmuted so we can hear it. Yeah.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Natalie Van Vliet, Associate Researcher at the Center for International Forestry Research. Thank you, Caris and Tanya, for inviting me to participate in this workshop. The results that I will present are part of a collaboration between CIFOR, Birmingham, Sheffield, Northumbria, and Manchester University. I'm going to provide you with a brief overview of the impacts of the COVID-19 on wild meat value chains in Nyangambi and Kisangani in the Democratic Republic of Congo. As we know, over a very short period of time, the COVID-19 had very significant social, human, and economic impacts across the globe. Many believed the origins of COVID-19 were linked to the trade in wildlife, and as a result, the trade came under greater scrutiny. General calls to stop wildlife trade were observed, particularly coming from conservation NGOs and a few governments. Some researchers speculated that the general calls to stop wildlife trade would lead to a decrease in wild meat demand. Some worried that these calls would disrupt food systems and increase food insecurity around the world. Other researchers thought that the economic crisis caused by the pandemic would contribute to the loss of jobs, leading to increased reliance on wild meat in response. Now, more than 2 years into the pandemic, it is possible to provide empirical evidence as to how COVID-19 has impacted wild meat value chains. We assessed the impacts of COVID-19 on the wild meat value chain in Nyangambi and Kisangani. Kisangani is the provincial capital of the Chopo province and the third largest city in DRC. The city lies along the Congo River. During the last 15 years, the urban population from Kisangani exploded from 250,000 inhabitants in 2002 to more than 1,500,000 in 2015. Nyangambi is a town located about 100 kilometers to the west of Kisangani, also along the Congo River. The town grew out of a huge research campus that was established by the Belgian government during colonial times. The town is located in the buffer area of the Nyangambi Biosphere Reserve. Traditional agriculture is the primary livelihood activity in this landscape. Apart from fish, there are few other sources of meat available, and as a result, wild meat demand is high and contributes significantly to people's protein needs. However, 2/3 of the households experience insufficient food availability to meet 2,000 calories per day, falling below the recommended intake. In this research, our question was to assess the combination of factors that explained possible changes observed in the wild meat sector during the first months of the pandemic. In DR Congo, a national lockdown was decreed on March 24th, 2020. This decree initiated a state of emergency which placed limitations on travel, prohibition on gatherings, and caused the closure of schools, universities, discos, bars, cafes, terraces, and restaurants. In Kisangani, restrictions caused the price of food items to increase sharply due to the lack of supply via the river and the containment measures imposed at nearby borders. In general, wild meat prices increased according to 74% of the households interviewed, leading urban consumers to eat less wild meat due to both the lack of availability and rising costs. In Kisangani, this had significant effects on food security, with a majority of households, 60%, mentioning they worried about their food security during their early months of the pandemic. These impacts were experienced less acutely in Nyangambi, where wild meat vendors stayed open and vendors and consumers reported no price increase for wild meat or fish. Some vendors did mention a decrease in supply. These may have been due to shortages in supplies needed by hunters. As one hunter explained, "I changed the frequency of hunting. There were not many ammunitions available because people circulated less during that period. I went hunting maybe 2-3 times per month instead of 5-6 times normally. We found that none of the interviewed vendors in Yangambi were concerned about the links between COVID-19 and wild meat. COVID has nothing to do with wild meat, mentioned one of the wild meat vendors. My clients paid no attention to that because that disease, we don't have it here, said her neighbor. In fact, only one person mentioned that wild meat consumption in their household reduced because of concerns of the links between wildlife and the origins of COVID-19. Similarly, in Kisangani, the decrease in wild meat consumption was not linked to potential concerns about the links between COVID-19, human health, and wild meat, but rather to issues affecting supply. Only a few participants agreed that the pandemic made them more aware of the health risks related to the handling of wild meat. In the Yangambi landscape, rural households were generally not concerned about the food security of their families during the first month of the COVID-19 pandemic. This is because most households could produce their own food. 20% of the households mentioned increasing their crop production during the pandemic, while 11% mentioned eating slightly more wild meat than usual. As one hunter explained, we observed the closure of schools and church, so we moved with all the kids to the camp inside the forest. I cultivated some crops there. We could go fishing and hunting all the time. This was a common sentiment. As restrictions prevented people from convening and socializing, families temporarily moved to the forest where they started putting more traps for wildlife and also fishing, gathering, and cultivating more small crops such as cassava, plantain, jam, and fruits. In conclusion, first, wild meat value chains were disrupted mostly by interventions used to reduce the spread of the virus, such as social distancing and travel restrictions, with impacts experienced more acutely by urban traders and consumers. Second, there were generally no concerns about the public health implications of consuming wild meat during the pandemic. Third, there were many instances where people turned to subsistence hunting as a useful pastime and means of coping with the value chain disruptions caused by the pandemic. Our results point to differences in how COVID-19 disrupted the wild meat value chains, with urban consumers and vendors more acutely affected than hunters and rural consumers, who were generally better able to cope. We suggest that this was at least partly because those in rural areas were able to fall back on subsistence hunting as an environmental coping strategy in the midst of crisis. Our findings highlight the need for greater attention to be paid to how different actors along the wild meat value chain are likely to be impacted by shocks and stressors affecting the sector, as well as new policies and interventions to regulate the sector. Our findings also stress the importance of preserving subsistence hunting as an environmental coping strategy, as it has proven to provide rural actors with a means of pivoting away from markets in times of crisis to ensure their own food security, income, and well-being. Thank you very much.
Okay, and the second one, which I'll put on, is a very short presentation, and hopefully I can share that easily.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Joseph Mbani, Research Officer at CIFOR, Bikram. I'm presenting today on the impact of COVID-19 on wild meat value chain in Cameroon. In recent years, COVID pandemic has caused major human life losses around the world, and concerns has been raised on the role of wildlife hunting and trade in the transmission of COVID virus and other zoonotic diseases, especially in tropical countries where bushmeat play an important role in food and income security. Effort to contain the virus and protect human life, so many people calling for the ban in wildlife trade and wildlife consumption. Another group cautioned that the banning on wildlife trade could have a negative impact on the wildlife supply chain and so on the food, nutrition, and livelihood security of many communities that depend on wild meat. Therefore, this project was undertaken to provide evidence-based guidelines for regulating wildlife trade to address the risk of COVID-19 without undermining the important economic benefit brought about by wildlife trade in both rural and urban Cameroon. The study took place in the southwestern part of the Xiao Forest Reserve in the Xiao and Lobo division. The survey design was adopted with 817 questionnaires administered to key bushmeat value chain actors, including hunters, intermediaries, vendors, and consumers. The questionnaire addressed changes in bushmeat trade during the pandemic. Our study results revealed three main findings or impact on the wild meat value chain. One is public health concern. Value chain actors slightly expressed concern about the risk of COVID transmission through wild meat consumption and handling. We found that hunters were discouraged to sell species like pangolin and monkeys. Vendors, 61%, also reported a reduction in the demand of these species. And these species, pangolin and monkeys, were almost not available in the market. We also realized that some consumers, 5%, completely stopped eating wild meat for the fear of contamination. Key finding number 2, disruption of wild meat value chain by government restriction. Government restrictions such as on transport led to lack of access to ammunition in rural areas, so decreasing the amount of commercial hunting, leaving traders with little supply for the urban market. 65% of vendors agree that supply in wild meat has seriously decreased while the buying price have increased, pushing 40% of them out of business, and they had to rely on activities like agriculture and sale of crops for survival. 23% of urban consumers were forced to reduce their consumption because wild meat was not available and very expensive. One consumer illustrated this challenge by saying that bushmeat was more expensive during the pandemic because many hunters had stopped hunting and bushmeat did not get to the city as before due to multiple checks by forest and wildlife enforcement officers. Key finding number 3, return to subsistence hunting. Although government restriction has caused a serious shift in food availability, it was surprising to note that 96% of rural dwellers did not worry about not having enough food during the pandemic. They secured their food by engaging in subsistence activities such as crop farming, hunting, fishing, gathering of forest products. Due to closure of learning institutions and the loss of jobs in urban centers, many of these people had to return back to their villages as a coping mechanism. So they engaged in agriculture and hunting. Therefore, there was more bushmeat available for rural dwellers. As explained by one hunter, he went hunting a bit more during the crisis to ensure the survival of his family, as other type of foodstuff had become rare due to restriction on transport. In conclusion, our study agrees with previous research and has demonstrated that disruption in wild meat trade chain is a major threat to food, nutrition, and livelihood security of many communities around the Xiao Forest Reserve, with urban traders and consumers being more affected than rural hunters and consumers. This was so because hunting in rural area acted as a cultural safety net that increased the resilience to shock of rural dwellers. Therefore, the banning of trade in wild meat and consumption cannot be seen as a solution. Developing strategies to promote sustainable wild meat trade while preventing risk associated with wild meat consumption may be a more effective and sustainable way forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Francis. So we're running behind schedule. So Yovana, on to you. And you still do, we'll still go for the 10 minutes, but then we'll move right on to Sue's final portion and then move on to questions at the end. And people can stay over if they have the time. Thanks, Yovana.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. That's it. Well, okay. Thank you, Tanya. Well, good morning, afternoon, and night for everyone. My name is Yovana Murillo. I'm veterinary and also the responsibility to manage the counter wildlife trafficking program in the Andes Amazon Orinoco region under WCS. Well, I'm based in Lima, Peru. Here is my home. And today I'm going to present a Latin American case study of change to wildlife trade governance to pandemic. Well, when we talk about Latin America, it's important to mention that we are talking about one of the most biodiversity region in the world. However, this biodiversity face significant threats, include the illegal and unsustainable extraction of wildlife and other resources. Live animals, parts, or products are accessible for consumption as pets in rural and urban areas in different countries in the region, include Peru. It involves different species, well, national and international demands, different routes that includes local and international, multi-species, and among other considerations. But it's important also to mention that in urban and rural places and also international markets, it includes the illegal and legal source. Well, let's move to Peru. That is the country that I'm going to present this with more detail, this study case. When we try to understand, or when we were trying to identify what happened here regarding the wildlife governance during the pandemic, well, first of all, I would like to mention that Peru is a country that allows the use and management of wildlife. These include international trade, as I mentioned. Here, the wildlife is managed in accordance with the provision of the Forestry and Wildlife Law. The institution who is in charge of this management is the National Forest and Wildlife Service, CIFOR, under the Ministry of Agriculture. This institution is in charge of the management of wildlife and forest and flora here in Peru. Well, CIFOR has implement different plans, programs relate to administration and sustainable use of wildlife and flora. But it's important also to mention that this institution has not the competence on wildlife health. To respond different actions or problems or different concerns about this, it's complicated because we have to involve different institutions, include regional, local governments, and also in some cases the Natural Protected Area Service, National Agricultural Health Service, among others. To be honest, in some cases, it's too complicated to obtain some response about wildlife health here. But when we talk with more detail about the Peruvian regulatory frameworks, it's important also to mention that it includes a series of conditions and prohibitions regarding trade, include uses, handling, transportation, among others, as a national effort to counter the unsustainable or illegal use of wildlife. I include on this slide different of these regulatory frameworks which implemented at national wide. And one situation that happened in 2020 was that in July of this year, the protocol for the implementation of surveillance, prevention, and control measures against COVID-19 in wildlife-related activities was approved under the Agriculture Minister. And this protocol this protocol helps to more to details to helps to prevent the COVID-19 infections between different people who are involved in management and use trade and activity-related wildlife here in Peru. Well, recently the Peruvian government ordered the extension of the health emergency until August 2022. Regarding this protocol, the objective is to establish the surveillance, prevention, and control measures to guarantee the health of people. As I mentioned, that closely working with or interacting with wildlife in diverse of facility situation. This protocol applies to people who serve as holders of enabling titles, administrative acts, and also the storage and the primary transformation of wildlife, of fauna specimens. Well, here there are different types of wildlife activities that I mentioned that include wildlife management and use, commercialization, and also different public attention and storage and first transformation. I list different activities related wildlife and management use and also commercialization because it's important for these discussions. And as you can see that there is different activities, for example, hunting, research, management of wild different species as vicuñas, because it's very common here to go and to collect different fibers for international trade. Also the breeding centers, there are different also different institutions who breed different animals to also to provide this type of wild animals for international trade. When we talk about public attention on storage, we are mention or include different facilities as zoo or rescue center who receive different people on these facilities. Well, but as I mentioned that this type of guidelines and this protocol approved the 2020 regarding COVID-19 or regarding the wildlife activities. It has different information, but more to try to prevent the COVID transmission and list different guidelines. For example, guidelines for mandatory hand washing and disinfection. As the same, they also include different specific guidelines for management and use of wildlife. Include the list. It lists different consideration as the maintains the distance person to person at least 1 meter. But the same is that we usually know about washing hands and different disinfections. Another type of personal protective measures that include is that for research in the field, also if the workers or people who are involved on wildlife activities work with primate or different taxonomic groups, important groups for this disease. Also, another activities relate to management wildlife in the field, for example, capture and sharing vicuñas. And at the end, some main challenges that we identify here in Peru, as I mentioned, that to try to respond or to attend different actions under wildlife health, it's too complicated because there are no competence institute who are in charge of these actions. For example, there is on this protocol, there is not a specific or admin policy on wildlife trade in response to COVID. This protocol considers different guidelines to prevent COVID-19 in wildlife use and management activities. Also, regarding combat wildlife trafficking action, for example, different authorities regularly confiscate wildlife specimens from illegal sources and also monitor the legal trade. So they are being exposed to multiple threats, including zoonotic pathogen transmission. And at the end, well, it's necessary and urgent, in my opinion, to establish a plan and also different actions work together in the same table with different multi-stakeholders and authorities because, yes, we have an open and different types to manage the wildlife, the legal trade, the facing different illegal activities, but it's important also to try to think together about the next steps to respond or be prevented for different to prevent different diseases regarding the wildlife health issues. And that's it, Tanya.
Thank you. That was lovely and so well timed. So we will move over to Sue to give us a wrap up and tell us about some global activity that is going on in this space. And then if people would like to stick around, we'll maybe have some questions. Sorry, Sue, you're on mute.
I am on mute. I'm talking to myself, and I'm also trying to upload my PowerPoint. Seems to be taking a moment. It says preparing your slides. So while the PowerPoint is loading, thank you can you see it full screen? Thank you. Yeah, a couple of comments and wrap up. We're running out of time, so I won't give extensive wrap up. Thank you to Chris for creating the context and outlining the context, particularly if we're talking, and I think what we need to be talking about is how do we prevent the pathogen spillover and the next pandemic of zoonotic origin, talking about that interface. And we're not talking about all wildlife trade here. We're not talking about food security. We're talking about that interface between people and live animals, particularly in commercial markets and land use change such as forest degradation, roads, deforestation, etc. Appreciate the presentation from Francis Mass, particularly some of the information on regulatory changes that countries have adopted, not only in response to COVID specifically, but also with thinking how to prevent the next one. Important to keep in mind when you say trade, the difference between domestic and international trade. And not all wildlife trade, of course, is live. Thank you very much to Lingyun Xiao for her summary of the China, the regulatory actions taken by the government of China. Again, we're not talking food security. We're talking about the wildlife consumption that is a luxury choice item in China, but decisions by the government of China and response to some of the voices saying China shouldn't have done this from those outside China who may not know the context in China. So really appreciate that, as well as the efforts, I must say, by the government of China to improve to make sure that the next pandemic does not originate in China. Thank you to the two presentations from Africa on the impact of COVID, not on efforts to prevent the next COVID, but the impact of COVID on food security and local consumption of bushmeat, wild meat, sorry. And thank you to Yovana Murillo for summarizing the actions that have been taken, particularly in surveillance by the government of Peru. There's a lot more that could have been summarized, I recognize. What I'm going to do is, see, can I advance to the next slide here? Yes. And what we've seen is a lot of national actions, which highlights the fact that much of this, not just the response to COVID, but efforts to prevent the next one, to prevent the pathogen spillover at source, must be done within a national context, of course, but collaboration, but I would argue, WCS would argue that collaboration between governments and a multilateral solution is also key, because there's no one country, one discipline, or one sector with all the knowledge and all the resources to prevent the next pandemic of zoonotic origin. China has said it's not going to be here, but we all need to work together, and prevention must be addressed. Preparedness is important. And it's important, we've seen some of the presentation, the nexus with biodiversity conservation is absolutely critical, but the risk of pathogen spillover is not only endangered species and not only illegal trade, but we have to look holistically and I would argue multilaterally at how do we, as a planet, because we're all so globalized, when someone markets a live animal in Kisangani and there's a viral spillover to local people there, it will be in London or New York or Tokyo within a couple days. We see that, and what do we need to do to prevent the spillover in the first place? I won't repeat this because Chris presented it very well in terms of the human-wildlife interface, but we need to look at prevention in a very integrated One Health approach. So what I'm going to briefly talk about, because we're really close to out of time, is what governments are doing and what we as academia, civil society, etc., should do in terms of pandemic prevention. How do we prevent the next one? There are other elements as well. Governments are now negotiating a new multilateral agreement or instrument on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. We would argue particularly from the perspective of equity, but also more cost effective, that it has to look at prevention at source in addition to other factors. The World Health Assembly has launched the process, has established an international negotiating body. Last month, there was a hearing for civil society, academia, NGOs spoke, we spoke on what should be included in this new agreement. I find it exciting that governments are talking about a new treaty or agreement. I find it worrisome. They seem to be forgetting about prevention. It's just easier to talk about how do we respond when it happens rather than how do we prevent it from happening. This is just the timeline, very rushed. The negotiating body is meeting next month. There are public hearings again next month, and there will be a progress report next year. And this agreement is meant to be agreed by 2024. So their governments are saying we must have an international instrument or agreement on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response within 2 years. That's great. We're hoping, we are pushing to make sure it includes prevention. And this map, it's hard to see, this whole negotiating process is led by the 6 World Health Organization regions, and the countries leading on that. For I don't have time to go into it, but there are one for Africa, which is South Africa, Egypt, the Netherlands, Thailand, Japan, and Brazil are leading this negotiation process. And that's a very quick run through because we really ran out of time. And I think we have a little time for those of you, we have 2 minutes, but for those of you who can stay on, if there are any other questions, be happy to entertain them now. Thank you. And I can unshare and see if there are any hands up. Any questions or any comments from the panelists as well, if we don't have questions. Why don't I see the hands? Are there hands up?
I don't see hands either.
I don't, that's why I can't see them. All right. Any questions? And if you do, have questions, but you have to jump off, we're out of time, go ahead and email them either to myself, Chris has his hand up, to Chris Walzer, or to Tanya Wyatt at Northumbria University. Chris, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks very much, Sue. Thanks for Tanya and everyone and pulling this together. Really interesting to see the broad spectrum of work that's been done here. I think one of the issues I've had, this is like, I don't know how many webinars I've done now, but one thing I have to say, we have to be really careful when we title these webinars. If we title a webinar Preventing Global Pandemics, then we have to actually talk about the global pandemics and not confuse that with very highly localized effects, right? So and I see that a lot. And the implication of that is that people who are speaking about global pandemic prevention don't care about IPLC's concerns with food security. And that has absolutely never been stated anywhere or has actually ever been pointed out. And there's quite a lobby actually in the UK for that reason, where they keep confusing these matters. And I think it's really up to us to be very precise what we're talking about. If we're talking about food security and inequities and justice, absolutely, we need to talk about food security, local communities and indigenous peoples and so on. But if we want to prevent global pandemics, we really need to make sure that the pathogens that humans are carrying, by the way, let's just be clear, it's humans that are going to be carrying these pathogens. So where are these humans going to be moving? Which airplane are they going to get into and where are they flying to? And that's where the interface is. And we need to prevent at source, but we need to make sure what the global consequences is and hold those apart. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate that. Any other comments or questions? Well, I think we are out of time. I also want to thank Tanya and Northumbria University for organizing all of this, and to all of the speakers for their input and presentation, and to all of you for joining and watching and listening. Thank you.
Yes, thanks very much.
Tanya, please, over to you. Sorry.
Oh, final wrap up, I would just say we will be downloading this recording and I will be uploading it to a YouTube channel that the British Society of Criminology Green Crime Group runs, and I can share that link on Twitter. So if you want to go back and revisit it or share wider with your networks, that'd be wonderful. Thanks very much for joining today.
Thank you. Take care.